There are many schools of thought that fall under the title of Buddhism. One of these schools is the School of Zen, which is an offshoot of the Mahayana School of Buddhism. The theory of Zen is extremely complex and confusing, especially to the Western mind. In 1957, Alan Watts published the book, The Way of Zen, to try and explain Zen to Western thinkers. Alan Watts was born to middle-class parents in Kent, England in 1915. He grew up homeschooled with a keen interest in the storybook fables and the romantic tales of the mysterious Far East. At a young age, he received Chinese landscape paintings from Eastern missionaries. This art sparked his interest in the relationship between man and nature. At age 16, Watts became a secretary for the London Buddhist Lodge. From here, his studies in religion continued. He eventually became an Episcopal minister after growing disenchanted with the Zen scene in New York. After an extramarital affair ended his first marriage in 1950, Watts decided to reinvent his life and began writing his theories about Western religions and Zen Buddhism. He then published The Way of Zen in 1957. Watts' The Way of Zen was destined to be a masterpiece, but first he had to figure out exactly how he was going to present such an ancient and complicated way of thought to the Western world, particularly to American culture. In the preface to the book, Watts outlines what his motivation and methods are for translating Zen for the Western world. He describes it not as a religion or a philosophy, nor as a science or a psychology. He calls it a way of liberation, something that defies all normal definitions. Furthermore, he describes Zen as an experience, nonverbal in character, which is simply inaccessible to the purely literary and scholarly approach. The problem, according to Watts, has to do with fundamental differences in the method of thinking between the two cultures. He cites language as the problem, but moreover the general thought patterns of people. Watts outlines his plan to try and convey what Zen is through three modes of communication in his introduction. First, he employs almost all the studies of Zen in the European languages. Then, he bases the essential view of Zen here upon a careful study of the early Chinese records. Finally, he derives information from a large number of his personal encounters with students and teachers of Zen over a period of more than 20 years. Zen Buddhism arose from two main schools of thought, Taoism and Mahayana Buddhism. From the Taoist school came the idea of developing original spontaneity, a linchpin of Zen. Although it is hard to pinpoint just when Zen was first created, Watts writes that it would seem to be sufficiently explained by the exposure of Taoism and Confucianism to the main principles of Mahayana Buddhism. Therefore, the appearance of trends very close to Zen can be seen almost as soon as the great Mahayana sutras became available in China, through the work of the great Indian scholar-monk Kumarjiva. The two earlier scholars of Zen were two of Kumarjiva's students, Seng Chao and Tao Sheng. While some believe that the historical beginning of Zen occurred in 520 with the arrival of the Indian monk Bodhidharma, Watts refutes this notion, claiming that it was a pious invention of later times when the Zen school needed historical authority for its claim to be a direct transmission of experience from the Buddha himself. 200 years after the Bodhidharma's arrival, the first Zen schools were established in China. The school divided into two sects in 1191. There is the Rinzai school of Zen and the Soto school of Zen. The main difference in these schools is that while they both place emphasis on Zazen, the Rinzai school places emphasis on Sansen, which is a periodic visit to the master for presenting one's view of the koan. Watts' initial argument is that before a real discussion of Zen can begin, it is important to look at the way in which language often blocks our understanding of other cultures. He claims that this is particularly true when dealing with Eastern and Western languages. According to Watts, Western notions of reality are constructed completely around language. Everything must be represented by something, be it letter or symbol. The argument is that education is meant to prepare a child to live in a certain society by accepting its codes of communication and convention. This is where our thought process first becomes locked into a set motion. The relationship between language and symbol, therefore, is the basis of our dual mind. We are taught to associate things with words, and in doing so, we eventually associate ourselves with abstract ideas of just who we are. Much like Taoism or Zen, every attempt to describe either one distorts the reality due to the uselessness of abstract symbols. Conventional thought therefore puts forth the idea that man should associate the idea of himself with equally abstract symbols and stereotypes, since these will help him form an idea of himself which is definite and intelligible. This is the basis for Watts' argument that Zen is the extinguishing of this duality of object and subject. He shows how the Zen path leads to the discovery of what the Paramartha, or what Nagarjuna describes as the ultimate truth, which was the inconceivable truth known by the Buddhas. This is in opposition to the Samvriti, or concealing truth, the world of linguistic and verbal expression. Nagarjuna's teachings are an important factor of Watts' explanation of Zen. Nagarjuna's method is simply to show that all things are without self-nature or independent reality, since they exist only in relation to other things. The argument continues, stating that through our language and convention, Westerners have created a world of duality. By this he means that in the Western mind, things cannot exist unless they can be defined against something else. For example, the mind runs in circles when trying to define good without evil, or up without down. The mind is so locked into the only alternative definition of things that it becomes divided against itself. There is the conscious mind, wrapped in abstraction and language, and there is the real mind. These, however, are not different. Zen seeks to end this division by revealing that there is only the spontaneous or real mind. A universal problem for the human mind is that the power of thought allows us to construct symbols of things apart from what they truly are. In the same way, we define ourselves and thereby lose sight of what we truly are. Watts explains how Zen practices help man realize that his subjective feeling of self is nothing but a construction of the mind. Furthermore, he claims that it shouldn't be identified with our real nature. The illusion of the split comes when the mind tries to be both itself and the idea of itself. It is once we are free from this that we are allowed to recognize the mutability of the relationship between all subjects and objects. Once this realization has been made, the mind sees that there is no difference between voluntary and involuntary events. The fact that we believe any of our actions follow a voluntary course implies that we have made a decision. However, when one sees something as involuntary, they are claiming that they made no decision, but the decision not to decide was, in itself, a decision. This leaves the mind in twisting knots and circles. The revelation that abstractions are not real leads the mind to the realization that all action is in fact inaction, that spontaneity is the basis of true reality and of what we truly are. Watts writes that this realization can only be described as the peculiar sensation of freedom in action which arises when the world is no longer felt to be some sort of obstacle standing over against one. It is a discovery of freedom in the most ordinary tasks, but when the sense of the subjective isolation vanishes, the world is no longer felt as an intractable object. This description reflects Watts' peculiar emphasis on the idea of spontaneous action and thought. When the world is free from abstraction, there can be no duality, no either-or. Therefore, there is only true action. He claims that it is when we make an effort to achieve something or to find something that we lose Zen. To strive for something is to put a duality between where one is now and where one hopes to be, or what one hopes to achieve. It is only an illusion that there is any difference between the two. This is probably the clearest description of Zen that Watts puts forth. Therefore, spontaneous action is at the center of all things. Watts described how this theory applies to both Zen and Taoism with the idea of this sin. That sin cannot be defined as either the heart or the mind of the person. Rather, it is defined as the totality of our psychic functioning. However, like certain processes of the body, it works best when it works as if it were not present. Once a man can let his mind alone, he begins to show a special kind of virtue or power known as te. This is not a virtue that one can use consciously, for to do that would again create a duality in the mind. Te is best defined as unaffected or spontaneous virtue, which cannot be cultivated or imitated by any other deliberate method. Spontaneous action is then put forth by Watts as better than reflection. He states this because so many people choose to reflect upon reflecting, and are therefore acting without free spontaneity. Action is often easier to perform without forethought than thinking is. It is for this reason that Zen often stresses action over non-action. The necessity of spontaneity with its relation to Zen is described most clearly by Watts as the way the mind must be able to reflect on its own, without abstractions getting in the way. He introduces the idea of the double bind, and the way that the mind is self-correcting. Zen, to Watts, is an affirmation that one cannot realize the spontaneous life by depending on the repetition of thoughts or other affirmations. One realizes it by seeing that no such devices are necessary, like legs on a snake. Watts writes that in Zen there is neither self nor Buddha to which one can cling, no good to gain and no evil to be avoided, no thoughts to be eradicated and no mind to be purified, none to perish and no soul to save. In other words, through spontaneity one learns that there can be nothing but this moment, that there is no past or future, for these are just abstractions of the mind. The moment is all that can be defined as real. In this way, all thoughts and actions can only exist in this very moment. Therefore, in Zen, there can be no definite distinction made between the realization of awakening and the cultivation of Zen in action. Extending from this line of analysis, Watts moves to a discussion of Zazen, and to the moment of Satori. The aim of Zazen is to just sit and open the hand of thought. This can be done through the method of the koans or through wholehearted sittings. The former of the two is practiced by the Soto sect, while the latter is more aligned with the Rinzai sect. Watts describes Zazen as one of the more important practices of Zen. This meditative state is meant to bring about a quiet awareness, without comment of whatever happens to be here and now. One cannot sit and think to obtain this purpose. In fact, one cannot even consciously think about getting rid of this purpose. The sensation of non-difference between oneself and the outside world, between the mind and its contents, should arise by itself. Zazen posture is very important to this process. The monk must sit in the lotus position with the body upright. The hands rest upon the lap with the left over the right, palms faced upward and the thumbs touching one another. The breathing is vital. It is regulated so that it is slow without strain and gaining its impulse from the abdomen